Tonight's broadcast brings us to Amsterdam, where economist and author Saifedean Ammous delivers a sharp thesis. In the next few minutes, you'll hear a chain reaction unfold, from the gold standard to World War I, from money printers to modern conflict, and why he argues Bitcoin is the clean exit. Settle in.
You're listening to Hopium Radio.
I'm going today to be talking about the topic of my new book, and a lot of it has to do with war, which is a very timely, unfortunately, and topical question to discuss. The relationship between fiat and war in particular, and if you want to understand why fiat does cause a lot of war and why I would say war causes a lot of fiat, we need to go back to Genesis, to the origins of fiat. And the origin of fiat, the Genesis block of fiat, if you want, was World War I. That's when the world really downloaded and installed this malware called fiat money. It happened in World War I. And it's a very important story which a lot of people don't know, which most people don't know, because we only found out the details of how this happened very recently, more than a century after it happened. Everything was hidden. And only recently have we found out about it. And it has not really been incorporated into the historiography of World War I and how World War I happened. But we're going to look at it today. So the key idea here we'll see is that fiat is born in war and it thrives in war. And it was thanks to fiat money that we had the bloodiest century ever in the 20th century. In fact, if you look historically before the 20th century, you see that human civilization was advancing, and generally wars were becoming a little bit less bloody. Even though technology was advancing, wars were less and less bloody and less total. If you look in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, you see that increasingly wars were being fought between professional armies in battlefields rather than being total wars of populations against each other and the mass murder, including mass murder of populations. But that reversed in the 20th century, and war went back to being total, and the normal civilized norms of war that had been developing over centuries were forgotten. In fact, we can also see it from this graph. We see the 20th century a massive outlier in terms of the number of people killed in conflict. And that's expensive. You know, killing people is expensive. If you try and do it at scale, I don't recommend you do it, but if you do try to do it at scale, it is pretty expensive. It's not easy. If you don't have a money printer at home to fund it, you're going to have a bad time. It's not easy to kill a lot of people. Highly recommend you go, if you're going to try it, highly recommend having a fiat money printer. That's why the only people that manage to succeed with this have a fiat money printer. So this is really because of fiat, and it's really, we could say that fiat has created generations of people who think that war is inevitable. It's just something that is always happening, it's always going to happen, and it's only a question of who's fighting who at this point, or who are we fighting at this point, but we have to be at war. That's just what humans do. And, you know, you see this when people say that we're just animals. Animals are always fighting each other, and humans are going to be like that too. But I disagree. In fact, historically, we see that war used to be a lot bigger of a deal than now. Countries didn't just go to war with each other. And wars were between armies in battlefields. And while battlefields raged with conflict, cities continued to function normally. And in fact, cities of warring countries might trade with one another while their militaries were fighting. Because under the gold standard, before fiat money, soldiers were expensive. War was expensive. If you wanted to launch a war, you needed to organize an army, train it, and you needed to feed it, and you needed to provide it with weapons, and that's just not cheap. And so if you were careless about sending your soldiers into war, you were careless about money, and you ran out of money very quickly, and if you ran out of money, you lost your wars, and you got overrun and conquered by others. So that made war expensive, and it made leaders and kings and presidents think a lot before sending soldiers into war. In that kind of world, defensive war would be popular. If somebody invades your country, people in your country would get together and they would want to defend. They would want to contribute money, weapons, or their own selves to conscription in order to try and defend the country. But if you're launching an offensive war, trying to conquer land abroad, it's very difficult to convince people to go and die for the king to have more and more land. So this tended to make conflict a little bit more expensive over time, and it made governments more responsible. And over time, the more responsible ones succeeded more, and the less responsible ones lost and got taken over and went bankrupt and got destroyed. So this was all going very well, but it all changed in 1914. Now, before 1914, we did have times in which governments went off the gold standard to fight a war. It happened often, and it was devastating and it was destructive, but eventually it had to end previously, because one country being off the gold standard was unsustainable. All the other countries were on the gold standard. And so the country that goes off the gold standard individually during a war ends up suffering economically. And so they have to reverse this decision. But that changed in 1914 with World War I, because all the major economies went off the gold standard. And so they could all inflate at the same time, and they managed to finance the war effort for a very long time. And that really made war permanent. It made the First World War last for a very long time, but beyond that, even after that, after the war ended, the natural state of a government was that it was now running a money printer and capable of fighting wars for a very long time. The distinction here is simple. When you have a money printer, you go to war and you can keep printing money until the value of all the money held by everybody in the country is destroyed. When you didn't have a money printer, when money was gold, you could only fight for as long as you had gold in your own treasury. So the government could only fight for as long as it had gold. Once it ran out of gold, it could no longer fight. Now, with a money printer, it's not about how much gold the government has. It's about how much wealth the entire country has. And so the government takes the wealth away from people just by simply devaluing their money, and therefore it can keep fighting a war for a much, much longer time, and it can keep financing the war for a longer time, and it can keep conscripting people and forcing them to go to the front for a much longer time. And that's why World War I lasted so long, and that's why since then war has become a lot easier. It's more it's easier to just take people to war. You no longer need the consent of the people to be sent, because you have their money. You control their wealth, you can take their wealth, and then you force them to go. You make them poor if they don't go. And even taxation is no longer needed for war. It used to be that you had to tax people, which is unpopular. If you wanted to ask them for money, you'd go and you tell them, give me money, I want to send you to war. They hide the money, and then it's complicated to go after them and try and find where their money is. But if their money is fiat and you can print their money, doesn't matter if they hide it, doesn't matter how well they hide it. Their money is being devalued because you're printing more of it. So you're taking their purchasing power, whether they know it or not. So you can pay for the soldiers to go to the war, whether the people want to pay for it or not. So what people think and what people say and how people vote become increasingly irrelevant in this world. Democracy becomes irrelevant. People's will and consent become irrelevant. You just print money and you tell them what's going to happen, and they have to deal with it. And if they don't like it, they are going to be impoverished to enforce it. Their wealth is going to go to make it happen, whether they like it or not. And the end result is that it's just now considered normal for many governments that, for many people, that their governments are just constantly at war. We see this all over the world. So how did this exactly happen in World War I? Why was World War I the point at which the monetary system really shifted from being on gold to being on fiat? Well, you know, the common myth is that most of those governments wanted to fight wars. Every government says it was a matter of life and death. We had to do it. And if we didn't do it, we would all get destroyed by the evil enemies. But they all did it at the same time. And they all went off the gold standard. They all increased the money supply massively. And in fact, there was a lot less public support for this war than most history books would like to tell you. And in fact, the most interesting story for me is the story of Britain, how Britain joined the war, because Britain at that time had the Bank of England, which was the world's central bank. It was really the world's first central bank at that time, because the whole world used to deal with the Bank of England, and it was the world's reserve currency. It was like the dollar today. So why did Britain get into war? Why did Britain sacrifice its position as the world leader, militarily and economically and in its empire, in order to go fight a war on the European mainland against its very, very powerful enemies and allies? Why would it get involved in this? It's a very interesting question. And if you look at it, you'll see that it was actually very different from the story that is usually told. So usually, historians like to say, well, Britain's hand was forced because of the invasion of Belgium, and they had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. None of that is true. In reality, Britain wanted to fight the war. In reality, the King of Britain wanted to fight the war, and he spent years getting into a secret alliance with France and Russia in order to convince them to attack Germany so that Britain would enter Germany. And in fact, they deliberately lied repeatedly in order to make this happen. They denied that there was a secret alliance in order to make it happen, and in order to make it so that Germany would not think that Britain would enter the war, thus Germany would enter the war. So they lied about the causes of war, and then most importantly, they lied about the financing of the war. In fact, to get just how incredibly unlikely the war was, when the Crown Prince of Austria was assassinated in Serbia in 1914, on the same day in which he was assassinated, the British and German navies were partying together in Kiel, in the north of Germany, where there was a week celebration where the Kaiser of Germany attended, and the British Navy attended, and the two navy and the two soldiers of both navies were partying together over that night when the news of the assassination came, and then the celebrations ended. And when they left, the King of Britain, King George at that time, left a message to the people of Germany saying, "Friends today, friends in future, friends forever." This was June 28, 1914. Within 5 weeks, those two navies were at war with each other. How did this happen? It's an incredible story. In fact, for 4 weeks after the assassination was not even discussed in the British Parliament. It was considered a completely inconsequential matter of Europeans fighting with one another, had nothing to do with the British. And then within 1 week, Britain was in war. The British Prime Minister did not expect that he could ever be dragged into war. But that's exactly what happened. And in fact, when more recently we've seen some of the documents come out, it's very clear that the British were setting it up as a trap. In fact, the King of Britain was trying everything to make that war happen without the British people finding out. But how could he pull it off? How could he manage to do that without a vote in Parliament, without the people agreeing with it? Well, it's because he had the money printer. And this is what actually happened. In 1914, there was a bank run on the Bank of England, and the Bank of England only had 31% of the gold it needed to back its currency. People started asking for their money. The bank didn't have enough money. So what did they do? Run the money printer. 300 million pounds were printed in August of 1914. And then, as the money supply increased, they suspended the redemption of gold. They told people they can't get their gold. So basically they went off the gold standard, of course, because now they can't give them gold. And then they tried to borrow. And so they ran a bond auction. And they tried to raise 350 million pounds for that bond auction, which was 55% of the public debt. So imagine the public debt going up 55% over a war. It was a huge bond sale, and with an attractive interest rate. And they thought, of course, the British people are going to buy it, but to their eternal credit, the people of Britain actually did not buy it. In fact, less than a third of the bonds were sold, and fewer than 100,000 investors in all of Britain, out of a population of 46 million, fewer than 100,000 people invested in those bonds to fund World War I. But the army was already at war. So what do? People don't want to pay for the war, but you already sent the army to war. You hate when that happens, right? It really sucks. I know, happens to the best of us. But don't worry, there's a way to fix this. And what is it? Fiat, of course. Fiat fixes this. If you ever find yourself in a war with no money, don't worry, Fiat fixes this. Just run the money printer. And in fact, what they did back then was truly astounding, because the Bank of England just extended a credit line to 2 of its employees who went and bought the bonds with their own bank accounts. They went and bought roughly 2/3 of the bond issue to fund British entry into World War I was bought by 2 guys. 2 guys got Britain into World War I. Of course, they worked at the Bank of England, so they got the credit line from the Bank of England. So the Bank of England printed a ton of hundreds of millions of pounds to them, more than the public debt of all Britain, and they used it to buy the bonds that made the war possible in 1914. And the next day, the Financial Times, the original shitcoin promotional telegram group of its time, published Same thing, same shit they do today, promoting all of the central bank propaganda and all of the central bank shitcoins and scams. They said it was oversubscribed, 250 million pounds more than what the government wanted to raise. People have bought these bonds with so much enthusiasm. We're going to war. Everything is great. That's what the Financial Times published. And then, of course, this only was found out in 2017. 103 years later, some people were digging around in the attic of the Bank of England, and they found a detailed study that is confidential, that was prepared in the 1920s, detailing everything that the Bank of England did during 1914, and it became clear that, in fact, the bond was not oversubscribed. And the Financial Times ran a correction 103 years later. They ran a retraction. You can see it in 2017. So what did they do then? They printed all that money, and they bought all these bonds. So of course they had to stop people from using gold, because if people continued to use gold, the paper money would collapse in value. So they stopped people from using gold. They took the gold from people, they confiscated the gold, and they gave people paper, and more and more and more and more paper. And they collected the gold and they sent it to the US for credit, and that's how the British entered the war. And by getting the US involved in the lending for the war, they made it so that the US now had a vested interest in the war, and in particular in Britain winning the war. So that's how part of the reason why the US would later join the war, because they were lending Britain, and if Britain had lost, the loans would be gone. So it's just one lie after another, and it's just a series of terrible consequences snowballing one after the other, and that's how we end up with hundreds of millions of people dead in violent conflict over the last century. This one lie continuing to propagate, really. And it completely upends our understanding of the war. It changes the way that we think of the war. And it's basically completely ignored by modern historians. Modern historians don't discuss this. It's actually remarkable. You know, it's been out, this news has been out for 7-8 years. You'd think all of the historians that write about it would be interested in it. But, you know, modern historians, they don't like to talk bad things about governments and government financing and central banks, because central banks pay their bills. You generally don't talk bad things about people who pay your bills, and that's why historians and economists don't talk about this. So Britain entering the war is a big deal, because this is likely why the war happened. If Britain had stayed out, France and Russia would likely not have intervened in Serbia. In fact, the assassination itself would likely not have happened. I think this is pretty controversial. You know, there's no evidence that the Russians instigated the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, but there's no solid evidence, but there's a lot to hint at it. And because Britain was entering, but it was secretly entering, it hadn't announced that it was entering, because they were telling the Germans we're friends forever a few weeks earlier. That's why Germany went into the war. If they knew that Britain would enter, they probably wouldn't have entered. So this lie has been an enormously devastating lie that has shaped our history over the last century and caused so much suffering. It has been a disaster for Britain. It's a disaster for the world. Britain went bankrupt effectively and has been constantly failing as a state since then. It used to be the world's dominant force. Today it's constantly regressing and becoming more and more broke and bankrupt and inflationary. Prices rose after World War I. There was a huge recession, and the problems of the 1920s followed, which led to the inflation of the 20s, which led to the Great Depression, which eventually led to World War II. All of that snowballing from that terrible inflation. And this was essentially how fiat money functions. This is how fiat money gets installed as a protocol. Governments spend too much, and then they default by confiscating and restricting the movement of gold. They suspend the redemption of gold, they increase the supply of paper notes, and then if they can, they try to get other countries to hold their reserve currencies. So because of this, because everybody's got this, everybody's got the money printed, and everybody's restricting the movement of gold, everybody now has the ability to fight a lot more. War. And that's why people think of war as normal. That's why people think of war as even a good thing. Some people even think that fighting war is good. You know, Americans think they're fighting wars for oil, as if, you know, their military needs to go die in the Middle East in order for them to have oil, which, you know, it will be news for people who live in places like Switzerland or Ecuador or Kenya, who don't have to go and invade the Middle East in order to get oil, and still they get oil. Miracle, right? Turns out it's not actually for oil, but it does work. So, now, interestingly enough, one of the people who was involved in that cover-up by the Bank of England of buying the bonds is a certain guy called John Maynard Keynes. You may have heard of him. They teach about him in school, and they tell you that he's a good guy and he's a smart guy. Well, he wasn't. He was an evil pedophile who raped children for entertainment, among many other horrible things that he did. Yes. And one of the things that he said, you know, he was so impressed with this, he called it a masterly manipulation. He was so fond of this. We're going to finance war without people even finding out. He was really excited about it. And he said one thing, he wrote a letter about it that was a confidential, that was also discovered just a few years ago. And in it he said, the capacity of the Bank of England to continue to lend depends on how much money people are leaving at the bank. If people leave a lot of gold at the bank, then the bank can continue to lend to the government and keep the war going. But if people take out their gold from the bank, then the printing is likely to cause a lot more inflation, and people are going to likely ask for their gold back, and that's going to devalue the money. So in order for this scam to work, people have to leave their money and their gold at the bank. Well, that then forces us to ask a very, very interesting question. Well, what would have happened if people had actually took their money out of the bank? What would have happened if people had an alternative mechanism for trading internationally? If they could move their gold to trade with one another and to trade across borders without having to go through banks and central banks. If they had that in 1914 and 1915, then likely the governments wouldn't have been able to continue with the inflation that would have kept the war going. If the gold could move without governments in 1914, humanity could have rugged the central banks and ended the war. Now, we know something that can move money around very quickly. Bitcoin, right? But unfortunately, 100 years ago, it was difficult to create a Bitcoin. But the premise of imagining something like Bitcoin in 1915 during World War I can help us think about what the world would have looked like. And that basically is the premise of my new book, The Gold Standard. What would have happened if something like the Bitcoin basically existed in 1914-15 and allowed government and allowed individuals to take their money out of the hands of central banks, and thus made it hard for central banks to inflate the money supply, causing this collapse of money supply, the collapse of fiat money? That's essentially what happens in this book in 1915. History takes a fork where instead of the war continuing for another 4 years of death, destruction, and devastation, we get this wonderful, beautiful machine. This is the Bitcoin of 1915, basically. Imagine in 1915 if the pioneers of aviation tried to, instead of suing each other, which is what they were doing at that time, if they decided, all right, let's find a commercial application of aviation. Instead of trying to keep making money out of each other, let's find a commercial use. Let's do what Henry Ford did for cars. And in this case, you know, with airplanes at that time, it was very expensive to move people around, so it wasn't a likely viable business model to transport people. And even with goods, it was likely not a very viable model to move goods around, because goods are pretty heavy. If you're going to move something around economically at that stage, it would have to be something that's very, very, very valuable per unit of weight, which obviously makes it obvious that there's only one thing that is the most valuable: gold. So if you set up a business for clearing gold with airplanes in 1911, then that allows people to have essentially a decentralized monetary system where they can move their money around without having to trust in their local banks and central banks. If we had built that in 1911, 1912, then by 1914-15, when the war started and the central banks started inflating, people would have had a choice. People would have taken their gold out. The fiat currencies would have collapsed. And that's the premise of the story that I have. In this book, central banks all collapse in 1915. The war, First World War, ends, and then empire and war are no longer affordable. Neutral countries like Switzerland and Holland, who, to your credit, everybody here, well done for staying out of World War I. Read this, seriously, tap yourself on the back. And in this book, Holland and Switzerland, they don't go into the World War I, and then all the neutral countries, they essentially become the superpowers of the world, because they didn't get bankrupt, they didn't lose all their gold, and they had all the gold from the other countries come to them. So, based on this, we get a new world order around the gold standard. So now, 1916, basically, the world is back on a gold standard, but it's a lot better gold standard than the previous one because it's a lot more decentralized. There are no central banks. There's no inflation. So then, what would have happened? How would the century have looked like? Well, we would have had free trade. We would have had monetary freedom. People would have had freedom to use money that was not inflationary. There would be no inflation. There would be a lot less war, a lot less conflict, a lot less ability for governments to murder people, and a lot more freedom, a lot more abundance, a lot more capital accumulation. Think about all of the capital that was wasted on war and death and destruction over the last century. Imagine if governments couldn't steal that from us and instead we could spend it and invest it on the things that we want. How different, how much more prosperous the world would have been. So I've spent the last year and a half basically trying to answer this question and come up with this story, which I hope you will enjoy. But before anybody gets angry and says, Saif is now becoming a gold bug and he's going to start acting like Peter Schiff and telling us to buy gold, don't worry, this is still a Bitcoin book. Orange slides back to orange from yellow. This is still a Bitcoin book because ultimately, for the purposes of this thought experiment, we made it so that gold moved around. But really, let's face it, it's very difficult to move gold around. It's a lot easier to move Bitcoin around. In the real world, Bitcoin still wins this war between gold and Bitcoin. Bitcoin remains our only chance of breaking out of this. Central banks captured gold before it could escape, and now they can always capture it, they can always neuter it, they can always stop it from being free money. But they don't have the ability to control Bitcoin, and they cannot capture Bitcoin. If we move to gold, they will rug us again, just like they've rugged us before, and they keep their wars going. If we move to gold, they will rug us again and keep the wars going. But if we go to Bitcoin, it's over. They cannot rug us. We will rug them. It's over. No more wars. Game over. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My books are available. My books are available outside at the hall. There's still a whole bunch left. If you guys want to come pick your copy up now, and I'm signing them. Thank you so much.
And that concludes tonight's broadcast with Saifedean Ammous. A reminder that money is never just money. It is policy. It is power. And too often, it is permission. If fiat can be printed in the heat of crisis, then crisis becomes the business model. But if money is scarce, the war machine meets its limit. If this segment stirred something in you, keep that feeling. Let it sharpen your discernment. Until then, stay steady, stay sovereign. This is Hopium Radio.
This is Hopium Radio, your #1 radio station, your favorite source of dopamine hits for your Bitcoin bullishness. Broadcasting every day on the internet, where every dip is healthy, every pump is inevitable, and every chart is somehow confirming the thesis. No financial advice, just conviction and bull speeches strong enough to make you whisper, "I'm never selling," like it's a bedtime prayer. So whether you're up 12% and feeling chosen, or down 25% and suddenly a philosopher, you're in the right place. Lock in, turn it up, and stack sats responsibly, irresponsibly, because you're tuned in to Hopium Radio, where the signal is strong and the positivity is borderline toxic.